having said that, not really, because I have no use for a car. Where I live, Melbourne's got great public transport, and I'm sort of in the city anyway, so it doesn't really bother me too much. But we've spoken about EVs before, Steve, and it's just I've got this first story just to pluck out that the idea that sales of hybrids are rapidly outstripping those of EVs in Australia. I'm not sure what it's like elsewhere, but I just found that interesting in that, they did have that, so hybrids had that push when they first came out that this was going to be what gets us off of, the standard car running petrol. And that kind of went away. And if this thing indicates anything to me, this particular story, it's that people aren't trusting EVs 100%, because if they were, they wouldn't necessarily go with the hybrid, which that probably makes them feel like that they're contributing to the cause of advancing in terms of some sort of renewable or greener type of transportation, private transportation. And but they still have the comfort of knowing that the internal combustion engine is still there in the event that the battery doesn't cut it.
Oh, Ben, I think one thing that our listeners might not appreciate is that you're actually a car lover. You mightn't have had a car for 10 years, but I know that you love and you know cars. So I think we're together on this one. But I think it goes further than purely the EV range anxiety. EVs now, have larger ranges, and, we're probably in the second generation of EVs now, technically, too, after a decade of producing them. But I think the reality is that people talk. I've got an EV, they will say, and then suddenly there's a whole lot of discussion around all the things that aren't so great about EVs. And it's not the driving necessarily or the range necessarily. It can be build quality, it can be software issues, and it can be the fact that driving an EV is a pretty soulless experience if you are a car lover. Hybrids, on the other hand, are fantastic. They lower our fuel consumption and they drive like regular cars with a whole range of advantages. So they're two very different vehicles. The traditional, even with a hybrid, is the more traditional experience where you buy the vehicle and you own the vehicle. An EV, typically, you might own the vehicle, but the manufacturer still owns the firmware and the software that you're using to interface with the vehicle. And I think all of us have experienced this with mobile phones. It's not always to your liking.
And I guess wrapped up in that is we don't know what the long-term consequences are of ownership of an EV, and where do we end up, 5, 10, 15 years down the track when, I'm humble enough to remember my very first car that I drove, and it was already, as I recall, 30 years old at the time when I actually started driving it, and I was still able to get another 5 years out of it. I just can't see an EV getting there, not without understanding some sort of roadmap for how you would swap out the batteries, and that not being an impost on the environment.
Oh, I think you're right. In Australia, and this is very different to other car markets around the world, but in Australia, typically a 10-year-old car still retains significant value on the second-hand car market. So the idea of trading in a 10-year car and getting something more recent or new is something that still happens in Australia. And there's been a whole host of reasons historically for that. But an EV, the battery life is 10 years, but I don't know who would spend the money on a new battery for their EV, or who would purchase an EV at 8 or 9 years of life. It just seems to me to be quite an interesting proposition, and one we've never had to deal with in Australia before.
Absolutely. Well, I guess something will have to be solved at some point. Obviously, there's the need to get off of cars using fossil fuels, but maybe we're a couple of generations before we will actually see the final version of whatever that happens to be, that replacement.
Well, I agree, and as I said to you before, I think EVs at the moment are probably the DVD of the car world, and will there'll be some generation of EVs in the future that'll be quite different to the ones today.
Just like we stream all of our entertainment now. Absolutely.
Exactly.